The New York Police Department is a busy place, full of cases, criminals, and secrets that few people know. There are stories buried within the building's old walls, truths that have never been brought to light. Today, Lisa Carter came here not as a law enforcement officer, but as a private citizen, a black woman in a place rife with bias. Lisa Carter, 42, is one of the toughest and most determined internal affairs inspectors the Internal Affairs Department has ever had. Her career has been spent investigating abusive police officers who disregard the laws they are supposed to protect. She has faced threats, even death threats, but Lisa has never backed down. As a black woman in the police force, Lisa has experienced many difficulties. From the very first days of entering the force, she felt the difference in the way she was treated. There were colleagues who always doubted her ability, thinking that a woman of color could not be qualified for this job. But Lisa proved otherwise. With a sharp mind, toughness, and an uncompromising spirit in the face of injustice, she gradually became one of the best internal affairs inspectors, specializing in scandals related to the police force. This time, her assignment was to investigate the New York Police Department, which was plagued by allegations of brutality and racism. Rumors of police beating black people with impunity spread throughout the city. Her superiors wanted Lisa to go deeper into the investigation, but instead of making her authority public, they asked her to do it secretly. Lisa agreed. She knew that only by seeing it for herself could she gather the most solid evidence. The New York Police Department is one of the largest and most influential agencies in the city. With its modern facilities and its bustling downtown, it seems like a bastion of justice. But behind its cold iron doors, injustice and prejudice still exist. For years, communities of color have spoken out about police discrimination. Unwarranted warrant checks, suspicious arrests, and unprovoked violence. These are just the tip of the iceberg. But the biggest problem is a legal system that seems to protect abusers. Officers who are accused of wrongdoing are rarely taken seriously, and many continue to serve in their positions without repercussions. Lisa had researched the police department thoroughly before deciding to go undercover. She knew that if she went in as an inspector, everything would be covered up. The officers would act professional, and she wouldn't be able to see their true colors. The only way to gather evidence was to become one of the victims, or at least put herself in their shoes. That morning, Lisa wore a simple light blue shirt, dark jeans, and old sneakers. She wore no makeup, and her hair was tied back, giving her the appearance of an ordinary woman. In her hand was a file bag, inside of which was a fake complaint form, the reason she would use to go to the police station. As she walked through the glass doors of the station, Lisa immediately sensed the heavy atmosphere. In front of her was a spacious reception area with an information desk and several rows of waiting chairs. A middle-aged white man was being greeted warmly by a police officer, while in the other corner, a young black man sat quietly, clearly forgotten. Lisa walked to the reception desk where a young officer was working. He was smiling and talking to a white woman standing in front of Lisa, but when he saw her, his smile quickly disappeared. "What do you need?" His voice was cold, completely different from his enthusiasm just now. Lisa took a deep breath, keeping her composure. "I want to file a complaint." The officer glanced at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Complaint about what?" Lisa set the folder on the counter. "A case of police abuse." The officer raised his eyebrows, then looked toward another police officer standing nearby. This one was a white man in his 40s, Brian Miller, one of the department's senior officers. Brian walked over, arms crossed, looking at Lisa with a questioning look. "You said you wanted to file a police complaint?" Lisa nodded. Brian smirked. "What's going on? Let me guess. The police asked you a few questions on the street and you were offended?" Lisa held her gaze. "No, this is a more serious matter. I need to see the lieutenant in charge." The smile on Brian's lips disappeared. He didn't like being challenged. Brian Miller, a veteran cop with over 20 years on the force, is the type of man Lisa has encountered too many times in her career. A man with power who uses it to oppress rather than uphold justice. He was a large man with muscular arms and a cold, angular face, but his piercing blue eyes reflected a stubborn and prejudiced mentality. Brian was not the type to be easily swayed. He believed that order could only be maintained through absolute control, and to him, black people were often the greatest threat. Over the years, Brian had received numerous complaints of abuse. Witnesses had reported him for his brutality toward black people, but he had never been punished. He had strong relationships with some of his superiors in the department, who were willing to shield him when trouble arose. The black community had repeatedly called for an investigation into him, but somehow it was always hushed up. To Brian, Lisa Carter, a black woman who was also an internal affairs inspector, was exactly the kind of person he hated. Lisa stood in front of the counter, her eyes calm but determined. "I want to see the lieutenant in charge," she repeated, her voice unwavering. Brian smirked, his eyes flashing with mockery. "You want to see the lieutenant? For what reason?" "I have a problem to report," Lisa replied, keeping her composure. Brian shook his head, looking bored. "Who do you think you are to see the lieutenant whenever you want?" He glanced at a white man standing behind Lisa, then waved him over. "Come here. How can I help you?" The man stepped forward, but Lisa remained still. She knew he was deliberately ignoring her, wanting her to feel looked down upon. But Lisa was not easily subdued. While Brian was talking to the other person, Lisa spoke up again. "I demand to see the lieutenant. I will not leave until I see him." This time, Brian didn't pretend to ignore her anymore. He slowly turned around, looking straight at her with cold eyes. "What's your problem?" He raised an eyebrow. "I told you, leave the complaint here and go home." Lisa crossed her arms over her chest, not moving. "I'll wait." Brian laughed, but his tone was contemptuous. "What do you think this is? A coffee shop where you can wait? I don't have time for this nonsense." Lisa still didn't move. "Then call the lieutenant out." Her defiance made Brian start to lose his patience. He hated people who didn't follow his rules, especially a black woman who dared to confront him like this. He leaned forward, his voice low but menacing. "Look, I have no obligation to serve you, so if I were you, I'd get out of here before I cause any trouble." Lisa looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not going anywhere." Brian sneered, then shook his head. "You're the type to cause trouble, aren't you?" He looked around the station, as if looking for someone to witness his teaching. "You're here just to cause trouble, right?" Lisa remained calm. "I have the right to file a complaint and go to my superiors. That is my legal right." Brian snorted, then jerked his chin. "You know what? I've met too many of you." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Like what kind of person am I?" He sneered. "The kind of people who always try to blame the police, always want to play the victim. If you were smart, you would go home instead of coming here looking for trouble." Lisa didn't answer right away. She looked straight at Brian, so calm it made him uncomfortable. "I'll say it one last time. Call the lieutenant out here." Brian gritted his teeth, his hands clenching. He could feel the eyes of several other officers watching, but no one said anything. They knew Brian's temper and didn't want to interfere. He took a step forward, his voice low and menacing. "I told you to get out of here right now." Lisa stood still. Brian lost his patience. Without hesitation, he reached out and pushed Lisa hard on the shoulder. The sudden push made her lose her balance and fall to the floor. Around, several other officers saw, but no one reacted. Some turned away, pretending not to see anything. Lisa put her hands on the floor and slowly stood up. Her lips were slightly pursed, but her eyes were still firm. She wiped the dust off her clothes, then looked up at Brian. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice still calm. Brian stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially by a black woman. "Do you want some more punches?" he growled. Lisa did not answer, just looked at him silently. Brian's anger flared. He clenched his fist, then suddenly swung a punch straight at Lisa's face. The punch was so strong that it sent her flying backwards, hitting her back on the floor. She tasted blood in her mouth. The police station suddenly fell silent. Several officers glanced at her, but no one spoke. Brian stood over her, still in his stance from the punch, his fists clenched. There was no regret or hesitation on his face. On the contrary, he looked satisfied, as if he had just done something completely righteous. "What?" Brian growled, looking down at Lisa. "Still want to resist?" Lisa slowly looked up. There was no fear or anger in her eyes, just a terrifying calm. She took a deep breath, feeling the pain gradually subside. All around, the other officers remained silent. Some turned their backs, pretending not to see anything. Others watched silently, waiting to see what would happen next. Brian snorted and shook his head. "People like you always think you're being treated unfairly, but the truth is you're just making trouble. If you had any self-respect, you would have left in the first place." Lisa said nothing. She put her hands on the floor and stood up slowly. Every movement was deliberate, not rushed. Her eyes were locked on Brian, making him feel that something was wrong. Brian raised his eyebrows and crossed his arms over his chest. "What are you standing for? Do you want another punch?" Lisa didn't reply. She silently reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, shiny metal object. In one sweeping motion, she held it up in front of Brian's face. Her voice rang out, cold as ice. "Inspector Lisa Carter, Internal Affairs." The room suddenly fell into deathly silence. Brian was stunned. His eyes were wide, his mouth open, but no words came out. The other officers standing around were also stunned. Some looked at each other, horrified, realizing they had just witnessed an assault right in front of an internal affairs inspector. Lisa kept her eyes sharp, watching everyone's reactions. She could see faces pale, hands starting to clench with tension. Some officers reflexively backed away from Brian as if afraid of getting involved. Brian swallowed. He stared at the badge in Lisa's hand, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. He stuttered, trying to find an excuse. What did you say? You're an internal affairs inspector?" Lisa didn't reply. She just looked at him, her eyes unchanged. Brian felt a chill run down his spine. He blinked rapidly, trying to collect his thoughts. Before, he had believed Lisa to be just another black woman, someone with no power, no ability to fight him. But now, the truth hit him like a slap in the face. He just attacked an internal affairs inspector right in front of his colleagues. The commotion spread quickly. A senior officer, Lieutenant Daniel Harris, heard about the fight and rushed out of his office. When he saw Lisa with a bleeding lip and Brian standing there, Harris turned pale. "What the hell is going on here?" Harris shouted, his eyes scanning the room in panic. Lisa did not answer immediately. She wiped the blood from her lips and looked straight at Harris. "I was just assaulted by Officer Brian while trying to file a complaint," she said slowly, clearly. Harris turned to Brian, startled. "Is that true?" Brian opened his mouth to say something, but closed it again when he noticed Harris's suspicious gaze. Lisa didn't give him a chance to defend himself. She turned to Harris, her voice calm but authoritative. "I want to review the surveillance cameras immediately, and I want all the witnesses here to write a statement on the spot." Harris hesitated. He knew Brian was a veteran officer with many connections in the police department, but facing an internal affairs inspector, he couldn't hesitate. "Okay," Harris nodded. "I'll check the cameras right away." He turned to a nearby officer. "Get the tape now." The officer hurriedly left. Several other policemen began whispering to each other, and the atmosphere in the station became extremely tense. Brian stood there, his whole body stiff. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He knew that if the tape was reviewed, his career would be over. He swallowed, then tried to smile, his voice lost. "Inspector Lisa Carter, I don't know who you are. If I did, I certainly wouldn't—" Lisa interrupted, her voice cold. "You don't need to know who I am to behave with principles. But you chose the worst way to behave." Brian panicked. He looked around, hoping for help from his colleagues, but this time no one came to his side. The officers who had been silent before now quietly backed away, as if trying to distance themselves from Brian. Lisa continued, "You attacked me without just cause. You abused your power, abused your position to treat others unfairly. And this is not the first time, right?" Brian opened his mouth to argue, but Lisa turned to Harris. "I am recommending that Brian Miller be suspended immediately pending an investigation." Harris blinked, but then nodded. "I will follow procedure." Lisa looked at Brian one last time. Her eyes held no pity. Brian, who once thought he could escape any consequences thanks to his connections, now felt as if the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. He panicked, looking for a way to salvage the situation. "Miss Lisa, I didn't mean to—" But Lisa turned her back, not paying any attention to his plea. The atmosphere in the police station was still heavy, but this time, it was clear that the situation had completely changed. After Lisa requested to review the surveillance camera as evidence, a group of officers quickly gathered in the surveillance room to check the footage. Lieutenant Harris stood behind Lisa, his face solemn as the screen replayed the entire incident. Harris sighed, his eyes fixed on the screen. He turned to Lisa, his voice heavy. "This cannot be denied." Lisa crossed her arms and nodded. "I want an official report immediately." A short while later, the detailed report was completed. Lisa had detailed Brian's every move, along with evidence from the surveillance cameras. Harris had no choice but to sign the decision to suspend Brian that same day. When Harris announced the decision, the entire police station was silent. Brian was still standing there, his face drained of color. "Brian," Harris said slowly, his eyes cold, "you are suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of the official investigation." Brian panicked. "No, you can't do that. I've been working here for over 20 years. You can't suspend me over a small mistake." Lisa curled her lips. "Small mistake? Do you really think that assaulting a citizen, especially an internal affairs inspector, is just a small mistake?" Brian turned to his colleagues around him, looking for help. But this time, no one dared to speak up. Some bowed their heads, pretending to be busy. Others just stood there, their eyes cold. "Hand over your badge and weapon," Harris declared firmly. "Now!" Brian trembled, hesitated for a moment, but then reluctantly took off the badge on his chest and the gun on his hip, placing them on the table. Lisa looked at him, her voice even but powerful. "Justice will always find the truth whether you want it or not." Brian swallowed. In that moment, he knew his life had just turned a completely different page, and there was no turning back. Just hours after Brian was suspended, the entire police department was plunged into a major public relations crisis. One of the officers present, no one knows which, leaked the surveillance camera video to social media. The video quickly went viral. Headlines appeared all over Twitter, Facebook, and news sites. "NYPD cop assaults black woman, turns out he's internal affairs." The truth comes out. Inspector Lisa Carter was attacked right in the police station. Police abuse, when the victim is no longer an ordinary person. In the comments section, thousands of people expressed their outrage. "This is terrible! If Lisa wasn't an internal affairs inspector, she probably wouldn't have had the chance to fight for justice." How many other people have been assaulted like this without anyone witnessing it? He must be punished properly. Not stopping at online outrage, a small protest broke out right in front of the New York Police Department. Dozens of people held up signs. "Justice for all! End police brutality! Brian Miller must be held accountable!" The police were called in to control the situation, but there was little they could do but watch. Anger was running high, and this time, they could not hide the truth. Lisa stood on the second floor of the police station, looking down at the crowd. She wasn't surprised by the public reaction. It was something she had expected. But this time, unlike the previous cases, she was the direct victim, and she was going to make sure that justice was served. Just a few weeks later, Brian was formally indicted on charges of assault and abuse of power. The New York District Court held a public trial, attracting the attention of the press and the public. In the courtroom, Brian was no longer the powerful police officer he once was. He sat with his head bowed, his hands shaking, confusion and fear on his face. The prosecution presented the surveillance camera footage as the most important evidence. Once again, the brutal punch appeared on the big screen. Murmurs rang out throughout the courtroom. When called to defend himself, Brian tried to find a way to justify himself. I didn't mean to. I was just doing my job. I don't know who she is." The prosecutor interrupted. "So if she wasn't an internal affairs inspector, you would have gotten away with it? Is this how you treat ordinary citizens?" Brian was speechless. He glanced at Lisa, who was sitting in the front row. She was as calm as ever, her eyes emotionless. Finally, after much debate, the jury reached a verdict. The judge banged his gavel and declared, "Defendant Brian Miller was sentenced to 2 years in prison and permanently stripped of his police badge." The room was silent for a few seconds, then a chorus of murmurs broke out. Lisa wasn't surprised. This was the verdict she had expected. Brian, on the other hand, was struck by lightning. He collapsed on the spot, his face pale. As 2 security guards approached to handcuff Brian, he suddenly knelt down on the spot. "Please," he stuttered, his eyes filling with tears. I was wrong. I don't want to go to jail. Please spare me." Lisa stood up and walked closer to him. She looked straight into his eyes and said coldly, "Justice has been served, Brian. You're just getting what you deserve." With that, she turned and left the courtroom, leaving Brian on his knees, begging, but no one cared. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.